When you create a spreadsheet in Excel, you type a lot of numbers and hopefully you realize that those numbers are on one level in your spreadsheet, and then the formatting, the dollar sign, the commas, even the decimal places are another layer on top of the grid that makes up your Excel spreadsheet. So today we are going to look at how you type numbers first and then add formatting by going to the number group in your ribbon and add the dollar signs, the commas, the decimal places, even some date formats so that your spreadsheet reflects exactly how you want those numbers to appear. Hi, I'm Terry, one of the Consumer Technology Specialists for Mid-Continent Public Library, and I hope you'll join me today as we look at that number group in the ribbon in Excel. For our first example, I've actually created it once and then made a copy of it over to the right because for our first example, we're going to look at both accounting and currency and how those formats are mostly similar, but also how they are different in some very important ways. Our spreadsheet simply lists a few stores and then what their sales were for a year by quarter. So I can select the numbers for accounting format and look at those numbers, and we can see that right off the bat. There's no dollar signs, there's no commas, there are no decimal places, it's just whole numbers. But we still want to format these numbers for our year-end report. So we can go up to the number group on the ribbon, which is kind of in the middle of the ribbon here, and the very first button on the lower left has a dollar sign. So we could just click on the dollar sign and it tells us that that's accounting, and we can format it as dollars, or we even have some other choices here, euros, for example. Or we can go to the right side of the button and click. And we have some of the top choices, the dollar sign in English United States being the first choice. And then as you go down, you can see we could have the euro or even the French part of Switzerland's currency as well. But we can come down for more accounting formats and click. And as we do so, the Format Cells window opens, and on the left-hand side, there are all sorts of categories for numbers. And it just so happens, because we click that dollar sign button, that accounting is the default. Now, as we look at accounting, we can come down to the bottom and it says accounting formats line up the currency symbols and decimal points so that they're all straight within a column. That can be important if you have a really large spreadsheet and a whole lot of numbers. This can be a big help. Well, let's also then look at our sample here where it shows that the dollar sign is, of course, to the left of the number, and then we have commas where they are needed and 2 decimal places. Now below that, it shows that while it defaults to 2 decimal places, you might decide to have 4 decimal places or no decimal places, and that is strictly up to you and what is required in your spreadsheet. Below that, we have the dollar symbol as the default, but if we go to the right and click the drop down, now we have the different symbols for the different currencies in somewhat alphabetical order here. And as I scroll down, you can see that these symbols are pretty small, so it's hard to see. But eventually, you even get out of the symbol list, for lack of a better term, and see that they start using, say, 3 letters to represent the different symbols. So as I scroll down, there are countries here that I had no idea they even existed, but eventually as we get to this alphabetical list with the 3 letters and get almost to the bottom, you can see that there's a USD. So instead of putting in a dollar sign, we could actually put the letters USD and then the numbers that we have in our cell right now. Well, having said all that and looked at a whole lot of different choices, I think we're just going to go with the dollar sign and click OK. And now as we look at that accounting format, notice that the dollar sign is on the far left of each individual cell. It doesn't bump up right against the number. For example, here in B5, notice that there's some space between the dollar sign and then the first number. Now it is right against the next number in B6 because it's just a larger number, and according to the cell size, that's where that dollar sign should be. But it's really important in the accounting format that the dollar signs all line up on the left side of the cell and are not necessarily right next to the numbers that they are explaining. To the right of that, then, let's look at currency. And again, I'm just going to select those 4 quarters. And I can actually go here to my dollar sign again and go to more accounting formats. But instead of accounting, we're going to go just above accounting and click currency. Now, when we look at this, we can see that we still get the dollar sign, we get commas, we get decimal places. Again, that choice for how many decimal places we want. We can choose the symbol from a drop-down list, just as we could have before. But this time, we also have the choice to express negative numbers, and we can make them with a minus sign or in red or in parentheses. And so the formatting of negative numbers, if you feel like that's important or even needed, is something that you might want to choose when you select currency. Now down at the bottom, it tells us currency formats are used for general monetary values. You want to use accounting formats to align the decimal points in a column. Well, we'll click OK. And now you can see that the dollar signs are up against the numbers. They're not on the left-hand side, and they just look a little less specific as the accounting does. And so it's really up to you and the format that you need to use as to which one of these formats you will choose, accounting or currency. In our first 2 examples, we added dollar signs in front of every number that could represent some form of currency. But a lot of people would much prefer to have those dollar signs only in front of the numbers for the total row and the total column, and keep the numbers much more plain in the details. So let's see how that would look. First of all, I'm just going to select my total row and add in the dollar sign. And then I'm going to go to the totals here in the total column and add dollar signs here. And then I'm going to go to my details and select just those detail numbers. And instead of adding a dollar sign, which again, some people really think don't belong in the details, we can go to the comma style instead, and let's click that. Now when we add the comma style in, notice that it adds the commas and it lines those commas up pretty much right with the totals, but definitely our decimal points are lined up in each column, so it is very easy to read the numbers and understand what the totals are, and even understand that the totals are dollars. So the comma style adds commas as needed and adds 2 decimal places by default. While we're looking at our sales and the totals here and how we've changed to a comma format and also a currency format, we might look at the numbers specifically and realize that there are no cents, that we just have zeros for those 2 decimal places. And we might decide to remove those 2 decimal places, even though we've already set up the formatting to have 2 decimal places. Well, we could select all of those numbers, so I'm just going to click and drag over all of them. And then when we go to the number group, the last 2 buttons on the right are either increase the decimal, where you can see that you have 1 0 and then an arrow showing that you're going to go to 2 zeros or 2 decimal places, or the last button here is decrease decimal. So it shows 2 zeros, 2 decimal places going to 1. So we could click on that decrease decimal button, and as you look at the numbers, you can see we now have only 1 decimal place. Click again, and we've removed the decimal places. Now let's look at the increased decimals as well. So we could click once to get 1 0 back, 1 decimal place back. Click again, and now we have 2. This comes in really handy when you have some formulas that create 2 decimal places for some numbers, 4 decimal places for others. You can very quickly go to a common number of decimal places by simply using these 2 buttons in the lower right. Now let's look at the last button in that bottom row in your number group, and that is the percent button. Now the percents can be a little tricky. They aren't just a formatting button, they also do math. And so you need to have a decimal equivalent to the percent, and then it will convert very well. But we'll also look at an example where you need to add in some extra division to make the percent actually work. So for our first example, let's do something that's fairly straightforward here, where we have these totals in column F, and we want to know, for example, I have over 8 million here. What percent is this 8 million of the grand total here of 58 million? Well, to do that, we'll click in G4, and then we'll type our equal sign, and we'll take that 8 million, F4, and we're going to divide it by the grand total here in F10. Now I know from experience that I want to always refer to F10. I don't want that reference to change as I copy the formula. So I'm going to click in front of the F of F10, and then I'm going to go to my keyboard and press the F4 key. Now this adds a dollar in front of the F and a dollar sign in front of the 10. Now these are not formatting dollar signs, these are actually formula dollar signs. And what they mean is we absolutely want to keep that reference to F, and we absolutely want to keep that reference to 10, meaning that as I copy this formula, that part of the formula that is copied that refers to F10 doesn't change. So now that we've done that, let's go to the left of the formula bar to the check mark and click it. So this says that the decimal equivalent of the percent for this 8 million is 0.138. Well, let's find the fill handle here in the bottom right, get the skinny plus sign, click and drag down, and now we have the decimal equivalent of a percent for each one of these numbers and how they contribute to the grand total. Well, now that I've got these all selected and copied down, let's go to the percent sign and simply click, and now we have the percent equivalent of each one of those numbers and how they contribute to the whole. Before we look at our second example, let's take a second and look at our spreadsheet one more time. And the thing that I'd like to point out is that every number in this spreadsheet is a whole number. There are no extra cents, and none of the numbers are just decimals of a whole number. So when we go to another example, it seems like they should work exactly the same way. So let's look here. We have a student who has grades for each day for a week. So let's figure out how we could create an average of those 5 grades. And the easiest way is to come over to G4, And then let's go to the right of our ribbon in the editing group where we have the auto sum button. Now the auto sum button generally adds rows and columns, but if you go to the drop down on the right, you have other choices. And the choice right after sum is average. So let's click average. And so now it says, okay, do you want to average the cells B4 through F4? Well, yes, that's correct. So we'll go to the check mark that's to the left of the formula bar, click it, and now we have our average. We can find the fill handle in the lower right of that cell, rest our mouse on it and get the little skinny plus sign, and then click and drag down. Now this is the average grade, but I would like to say, well, it's 91% or 82%. So it seems like all I would have to do is go to the number group, go to the percent sign, and click. But look what happens. And this is where we know that the percent sign, when we use it, not only formats with that percent sign on the right of the numbers, but it also multiplies by 100. So if I have a decimal and I multiply by 100, like we did in our first example, then I get a whole number and a percent sign. That works great. But with our second example, that's way too much. So what we need to do is this. We need to go up to our very first formula that we created where it has equals average B4 through F4 and click to the right of that, and this time I'm going to add in dividing by 100 so that it makes this a decimal so that the percent sign can then use the decimal equivalent to actually work things out right and correctly format for a percent. So let's click on the check mark, and then we can click and drag down. And now we have the averages that we were looking for. So just know that if you run into an issue with the percent sign, that first of all you need the decimal equivalent and that the percent sign multiplies by 100. If you have all whole numbers, you may find that you need to come up to your formula bar and divide by 100 to get the decimal equivalent, and then your percents will work really well. Now let's look at the top portion of that number group where we have a kind of a text box running across the top, and it is called the number format. And when I click the drop down here, while it starts with general, notice that we have all of these other options for number, currency, accounting, different kinds of dates and times, percents and fractions, and then even more number formats. So we can go into depth when we want to actually add formatting to our numbers. Well, let's see just how some of this works, and we could start with general. It's no specific format, so if I type the word text and then press tab, you'll notice that text, because it is text, lines to the left part of the cell, and it looks just sort of normal. All right, well then let me type a number here and press enter. And you'll notice that, again, it is just general, so it's not trying to add any decimal places or any commas or anything like that. It just took my 4 digits and let me type a number. Now, when I come down and type, say, another number, let me do something like that, and then come back to our bar here and click on the drop down. Let's go to number. And you can see that number automatically added 2 decimal places. Now, what's interesting is it didn't add a comma, just the 2 decimal places. So maybe that is something that would be helpful for you given a chance. Now let's look and see what else is here. So we've done number. Now we've already seen currency and accounting. Next we have short date. So let's start with just typing something. And I think I'm going to type 4/1/2021. All right, now maybe that is a short date. I guess we'll find out. Let's click short date. Yeah, that is the short date, but let's come down again and let's look at long date. Oh, and that's way too narrow. All right, now the long date has added the day, spelled out the month, and just made it look a little more official for sure. So these are all part of the date formatting that is available. Well, let's click down and let's see what else we have here. Time is next. So, gosh, let's see. I could type 1 o'clock P maybe, and press enter. Oh, and it already added the PM for me. So let's see what time is all about. When we add in time, it has the hour and the minutes and the seconds that it automatically formats for you. Well, that's really getting into the details, but that is one of the ways that you can define time within your spreadsheet. Well, let's see what else is here. So we have percentage, which we kind of already looked at, and then we have fraction. You know, I think I'm going to start with defining that cell first. So I'm going to come down to a blank cell and go back to fraction. And then I'm going to type just 1/2, and it lets me type the fraction rather than trying to do some division and giving me 0.5 instead. So that is a way that you can write fractions within your spreadsheet. Well, let's click on the drop down here because we do have some other choices. All right, scientific notation is really kind of interesting. So again, let me type something really big here. So I have 1 through 9 and then added a 0 at the end. Now let's go to scientific. And scientific is going to take that first number that I typed, the 1, and it puts in a decimal place. Then it even shows you the next couple of digits that you typed in, but it tells you that overall, past that first number that you typed, there are 9 more numbers that you have typed in there. So let's see, let's count. I did a 1, then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. Yes, that is 9 digits. So scientific notation is very interesting. Occasionally, Excel will put that in when you type in, say, a social security number or something. So always make sure that your columns are wide enough and defined correctly so you don't get scientific notation when you don't want it. Well, let's go back because I believe there was one other setting here. Oh yes, text. So here's kind of a fun one. Let me type in today's date again. And for some reason, I've decided to turn that to text. So let me click on the drop down and go to text. What is that? 44,287. Well, what that is how Excel actually creates dates in your spreadsheet. So January 1st, 1900 was 1. And each day after that has its own equivalent within those numbers. And if you take a date and say, okay, I want to change it to text, it actually shows you what that underlying number is. But that's how Excel can take two dates and then subtract one date from the other. It can determine which date is larger than the other or smaller than the other because it compares these underlying numbers that you can see with text. Now, there's another reason why you might want to use text. So let me come back and define my cells text first. Initial zeros don't show up when you type, and that makes sense. Why would you have a 0 and then a bunch of numbers? However, if you're typing in part numbers, model numbers, employee numbers, and they have a 0 in them, one of the ways to define those numbers is to use text so that you can get that initial 0. So let me just type a really small example here. And you'll notice that it's text because it lines up on the left, but it also has kept that initial 0. So some really neat things that you can do by changing how your cells and the contents of those cells are defined. Even though we've looked at a lot of different kinds of formats, believe it or not, there are even more that you can use. So how do you find those other formats? Well, you could go up to that number format box, click the drop down, and come all the way to the bottom where it says More Number Formats. Or you can go to the bottom right of that number group and find the little arrow that is pointing down and to the right, and it is called a dialog box launcher. So when we click on it, it brings up the same dialog box, and we get a whole lot of categories. Now, general, we've already kind of seen that, but even with number, now we could add in thousands separators and negative numbers that we couldn't do with what we had on the ribbon. With currency, we've already seen that as we have accounting, but now date, you can add in all sorts of dates that we did not even try to look at or find. And it even has dates for different locales. In other words, in England, most European countries, I believe they put the day first and then the month, rather than the way we write our dates. For time, you have lots of choices as well, and again, you have location preferences. For percentage, well, that's kind of what we've already seen. For fractions, it gives you some ideas of how to use that. For scientific, you can choose the number of decimal places involved. For text, well, we've seen how that could already work. But then we have special, which is one of my favorites, and we may even do a really short video on this later, where depending on how you define your fields and probably how your columns are laid out, you could define them as zip code and zip +4, phone number and social security. So you don't need to type in all that punctuation. You just go to number format and special, and Excel puts all of that in for you. Again, it might depend on the location and what, say, address you're talking about, but Excel can take care of that as well. And then there is custom. So here are some formats that you haven't seen before, and it's where you can add your own format. So let's say that you have some sort of a number that you use, an identifier of some kind with dashes, and maybe it starts with or ends with certain letters, and you can't really find that or very easily automate it in Excel. But lots of times, if you come here and create your own custom cell format, you can do some really neat things. So again, this may be a future short video down the road. So, are you ready to format your cells in Excel? Remember, you have all of these choices in the number group, and then even more in that drop down, and then even more when you go to more number formats. To learn even more, be sure to go to mymcpl.org/online learning, where you will find great online resources that include Universal Class, lynda.com, and Learning Express Library. Tune in each week as we introduce new videos on a variety of tech topics. You can find us at 1 o'clock on Wednesday and Friday and 2 o'clock on Tuesday. Be sure to find us on Facebook at MCPL 360, or if you prefer, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel at MCPLMO, where you can find our MCPL Consumer Technology Resources playlist.